The Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers. Each week we broadcast new videos from our 10-year speaker archive online for free at our website. We look forward to seeing you again when it's safe. Please enjoy this presentation from the archives of the Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. 7 o'clock, and I am Louis Frumkes, welcoming you once again to the Writing Center's Literary Cultural Series at Hunter. This is the second in our Great Thinkers series, and you will remember Ned Block was here a week or so ago, and tonight we have Harry Evans, and I will introduce him in a minute. I should point out that while most of you know that Margaret Geller is coming down from the Harvard-Smithsonian Astrophysics Institute on April 9th, you may remember that last year we had Alan Guth speak. And those of you, I guess, who are interested in science, and even those of you who are not interested in science, should be aware that just the other day, some folks at the Astrophysics Center in Cambridge announced that they had found some gravity waves from the original Big Bang. Alan Guth was responsible in 1979 for a mathematical breakthrough that really put the idea of an inflation universe, that the universe is inflationary and expanding forever, etc., on the map, and the other day it was corroborated. This is analogous to when some of Einstein's theories were 30 or 40 years later corroborated through experiment, and they hold almost about the same importance. Essentially what we learned is that in the first trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second after the energy of the so-called Big Bang, huge forces were put into play, and the universe as we know it has expanded ever since in a very symmetrical way. And the idea that came out of all this is that it happened once, but it's probably happening on an even larger scale beyond anything we can ever hope to observe or imagine, and that is probably having millions and billions of time over. So we are now confronted with a multiverse, and if Kovac and the various people up there are able to substantiate what they have been studying for 3 years with very, very super sensitive computers and instrumentation, this will be one of the biggest discoveries in the last 100 years in science, and they will win Nobel Prizes and so forth and so on. So Margaret, who is one of the pioneers in mapping the universe, will be here on April 9th, and I hope you all will come down to hear her. Whether you are interested in science or not, it has great implications for all kinds of other speculation. Meanwhile, our second great thinker tonight is Harry Evans, and he is not insignificant himself, and let me introduce him to you informally. So what does Tina Brown, former editor of Punch magazine, where, incidentally, I cut my teeth, and the New Yorker magazine, see in Harry Evans? Good question. Besides his obvious good looks, Harold Evans was the editor of the Sunday Times and the Times in London. He followed the late Alistair Cook in Commentaries on America for the BBC. He holds the British Press Awards Gold Award for Lifetime Achievement of Journalists, and in 2001, British journalists voted him the all-time greatest British newspaper editor. In 1984, Harry moved to the U.S., where he taught at Duke University. He was subsequently appointed editor-in-chief of the Atlantic Monthly Press and became editorial director of U.S. News and World Report. In 1986, He was the founding editor of Condé Nast Traveler. Then from 1990 to 1997, Harry was appointed president and publisher of Random House Trade Group, as well as editorial director and vice chairman of the U.S. News and World Report, the New York Daily News, and the Atlantic Monthly. His best-known book, The American Century, won critical acclaim, and the sequel, They Made America, both which we have here tonight, described the lives of some of the country's most important inventors and innovators. Fortune magazine identified it as one of the best books in the 75 years of that magazine's publication. These are some of the reasons that Tina loves Harry, married him, and has 2 children with him. In fact, I'm sure this is more important to her than the fact that Sir Harold Evans was knighted in 2004. And I'm leaving out the big things in his life. These are some of the esoterica. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Harry to you this evening at Hunter College as one of our great thinkers, so he can tell you a little more about his life in journalism and charm you in a way that only he can do. And before, when we were chatting, he mentioned he just signed a contract for a new book on writing that will be coming out next year, but he can tell you more about it. Harry?
I'm terrified. The life you described, it seems to have so much in it. And yet, to me, it seems to have gone very quickly. I want it to go on a bit longer, of course, with the Lord's blessing. It's very gratifying to be here. Do I make myself clear? You can hear me? That's the title of my new book, Do I Make Myself Clear? Because I actually have read so many things which made me feel I was going crazy, where the proliferation of words didn't make any sense. And that happens so often. In fact, I'm sure that I must have written a vast quantity myself. So let me tell you why I began to get these symptoms of elderly dogmatism about writing in particular. I wasn't very clever. I mean, at least the war was on, and I didn't pass to go to a high school. But my mother and father paid for me to learn shorthand and typing. And I wrote to every newspaper I possibly could. And I stamped this envelope, and somebody steamed the stamps off because I never got an answer at all. But the key moment in my life, which I've described about in my paper chase, it still lives with me because I got a call to come to this weekly newspaper. And that's all. It just said, come and ask for Middlehurst, who was the sort of editor fellow. And when they went in, he was talking to somebody else, a printer. And he obviously didn't want to bother with me. I was a kid in short pants, as a matter of fact. You didn't graduate to long trousers, as my friend over here from England will testify, until you were about just past 16. And I was barely past 15. And he thrust these papers into my hand and said, asparagus, boy, quick about it. Oh, cracker mighty. So I took the pages away and looked for asparagus. And I thought there must be some recipe here or some report on farming. And I went through it, and my heart was pounding and sinking. This is my big chance in journalism. Where the hell was this story about asparagus? And then a young kid who came along like this, I later discovered he was learning to play the piano, so he was always washing his hands as though he had some kind of phobia. But this was learning to play the piano. He said, oh, let me have a look. Oh, he said, it's quite easy. Write these up as paragraphs. Oh, as paragraphs. There were stories about church sermons and accidents, so it was easy. All I had to do was write a paragraph like that. And that was a great beginning for journalism, because if you can't write a paragraph that short and make it make sense, you should find another line of work. So I stuck with it, became a newspaper reporter, finally went to university, and amazingly to me, not only did I get a good degree, but I came to the United States on a postgraduate fellowship at Harvard, at Chicago and Stanford. My daughter's at Harvard, I get mixed up, and traveled across the country through the Deep South. And that was incredible. And if I ever wanted to be a writer, this was the occasion for seeing what I could never forget. Have you seen 12 Years a Slave? I saw that the other night. I cannot forget what it was like going with these very, very gracious people in the plantation homes in the Deep South. And because I had an English accent, they thought it was at least related to a duke or maybe even to the king. It was very, listen to Mr. Evans. But I'll never forget the shock of having these gracious dinners, and they said, we know how to lecture our niggers, you people should keep out of it. You people from the north, because I'd just traveled from Chicago University. And so I wrote about this a bit. I wrote for The Guardian what it was like. I actually interviewed the first member, the first founding director of the White Citizens Council in Mississippi, and he said, hey, we saw you were shaking hands with a nigger back there. I said, yeah, it just seemed natural to me. I was completely wrong, by the way, when I said there is no racial prejudice in England. It turned out not to be true. Everybody has these sediments of prejudice. So how did I get from these early adventures to become a publisher and a writer? I want to say to the writers among you, and I'm sure there's some very practiced writers here and some people starting, that the only advice I can give about writing is write and rewrite. My toughest job as a writer ever wasn't writing about thalidomide, the greatest drug disaster, or the DC-10 airline crash, or editing the memoirs of Richard Nixon, or editing the memoirs of Henry Kissinger, or just recently editing his history of China. My toughest task was writing a book called How We Learn to Ski, because I'd taken up skiing at mid-age, 44, and I was humiliated. I thought I was a natural athlete, and I couldn't get down the mountain. So I came home and I recruited some other people, and we went off to the mountains to write. And you try and write. How many skiers are here? Okay, well, you try and write how you make a stem Christie and make sure that it's comprehensible so that somebody doesn't break his neck on the mountain. So we kept trying and trying and trying, and that taught me quite early on, rewrite, test it. And many people are frightened of rewriting, which they have to do. So let me just talk a little bit about publishing. And those of you, some of you probably are published authors anyway. It's quite fascinating. When I was president of Random House, and I restarted the Modern Library of Classics, because when I was a young student in Chicago and Stanford, and I had not much money, this still seems to be true, actually, I had not much money, considering everything keeps going up in price. When I was there, I bought the Modern Library of Classics whenever I could. And so I restarted the Modern Library of Classics when I got to Random House, and got the great writers back into print for very, very little money. And that, to me, was one of the most exciting things. And yet, it's a perilous business, publishing. Let me give you one example. When I was president of Random House, there was one here when we had 8 of the 12 books selected by the American Library Association as being the best books of the year. David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker now, Lenin's Tomb, Gore Vidal, United States History, Martin Kelly, Martyr's Day by Michael Kelly. You'll know some of these books, I'm sure. So I said to my finance director, we now go to the management and tell them, look here, how quality pays, and stop criticizing for my spending money on these writers. And the finance director came back and he said, I haven't got very good news. I said, well, go on, what is it? He said, well, out of the 8 of the best quality literature the Library Association collected, put them all together, you lost $370,000. oh, cracky. I said, go back, forget about the Library Association. Let's go and have a look at the New York Times bestseller list. I said, we had 21 the books of the year on the New York Times bestseller list. So I'd go back and tell me how those 21 brilliant books made a lot of money. Finance director coming in again, I could have killed him. He said, what do you want first, the good news or the bad news? I said, give me the bad news. The bad news, he says, you lost $698,000 on all those books. The New York Times, wonderful books. So I said, well, we said, but cheer up. He said, you published 2 books that made $2 million profit. So the point about what I'm trying to get over is that publishing is so random, and it's even more difficult today. But a good publisher will lose money on a book of poetry and know that a book called How We Learn to Ski, which sold nearly 1 million copies, is going to make a difference so you can sustain good writing. My experience as a writer was finding it very hard. And anybody tells you it's easy is not a very good writer. My most prolific experience has been as an editor, editing other people's work. So when I was first met Henry Kissinger, for instance, back in the 60s, and he was writing a book, and my newspaper was about to publish extracts from it when we got out of being strike-bound. And so I edited Henry Kissinger, and then later on I edited Colin Powell, Nixon, and the characteristic of all these, I mean, many famous statesmen and others, controversial people or not controversial people, the interesting thing to me was that when I came across a bad sentence or unstructured argument, the more famous the people accepted immediately and didn't argue. And the more mediocre writers, and I found this true at Random House, always arguing. So it made me think, why is it that these big men are able to recognize that they've made a lousy, terrible mistake? And unfortunately, I then moved on to sign up Marlon Brando and try to edit Marlon Brando. Now you try and edit Marlon Brando. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, before I went to buy the book for Random House, all the publishers, Knopf, Simon & Schuster, came back and said, it's an ordeal. It's an ordeal. You get down there, the first thing he says, go on your knees. And quite a lot of people went on their knees. I had an excuse. I knew he was going to ask me to get on my knees, and I said, when he said it, I said, I'm sorry, I have a very bad knee, and if I go down on my knees, I won't be able to get up again, and you'll have a problem disposing of the body. So he accepted that, to my astonishment, but he was enormously paranoid. And I don't know how, as a publisher, one deals with this, but it was very dark. It was about 12 o'clock at night. My company had sent a car outside for me, and as we stood in the moonlight, he said, "You're CIA." I said, "No, I'm not CIA." And he said, "Yes, you are. Show me your handwriting. Write this right here now on this piece of paper." So I wrote my proper name on the piece of paper and gave it to him. And he said, "I don't trust you because of your wife." I said, "What's she done wrong?" And actually, she'd published something in Vanity Fair that he didn't like. So he'd already formed a resentment against me. And he said, "You are publishing CIA writers." I said, "Wait a minute, who's the CIA?" He said, "Peter Matheson." I said, "Peter Matheson's a brilliant writer. He's come to the defense of the Indians and so on. He's a friend of mine. I know for a fact you're talking nonsense, Mr. Brando." And he said, "Well, listen, I went to his house in Long Island, and I left something behind, a scarf, and I went back, and he wasn't there. We'd been talking for quite some time, and he wasn't there, and I looked on his desk, and he's CIA." About 3 years later, Peter admitted that he'd been recruited by the CIA. and yet this brilliant writer. And here was this nutcase, excuse me, Marlon, that's what I regarded you as, who was telling me something which was true, which I never would have believed. So it's a very exciting business, going from being a writer. And I tell you what, when you struggle as a writer, you actually learn to recognize really good writing. Really good writing, which appears fantastically simple. I mean, I brought along, and I urge you, if you've not read it, Roger Angell in the New Yorker on getting old. Now, some of you may not fear the prospect of getting old. But let me tell you, somebody who's past that frontier, this is a revelatory piece. Now, how can you write an interesting piece about getting old? Creak, 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 grunt, grunt, groan, cough, cough, cough. How can you write an interesting piece about getting old? Roger Angell. Incidentally, he's related to E.B. White, who wrote Here is New York, and don't live in New York unless you have the gift of hope. Don't live in, it's marvelous, wonderful piece of writing by E.B. White. And so I invited Roger Angell, who my wife knew him very well, for lunch, and I asked him how he wrote this piece. Well, just let me read you 2 little bits to give you an idea why it's good. This is how he begins. How would you begin writing about getting old? Just think. I mean, I know what I'd write. Why is it that my joints ache, and whatever, and why is it this, and why is it that, and what is it this, and who is it this, and what would you write? How can you make an interesting piece about getting old? And here's how he begins. Check me out. Check me out. Short, simple, declarative sentence. The 2 top knuckles of my left hand look as if they'd been worked over by the KGB, same as mine. No, it's more as if I'd been a catcher for the Hall of Fame pitcher, Candy Cummings, the inventor of the curveball, who retired from the game in 1877. To put this another way, if I pointed that hand to you like a pistol and fired at your nose, the bullet would nail you in the left knee. And that wonderful few lines, then he ends it, full stop, arthritis. Then the next sentence says, now still facing you, if you cover my left or better eye with one hand, what I see is the blurry encircling version of the ceiling and floor and walls or windows to our right, but no sign of your face or head, nothing in the middle. If I reverse things and cover my right eye, there you are, back again. If I take my hand away and look at you with both eyes, the empty hole disappears and you're in 3D and actually looking pretty terrific today. Full stop, macular degeneration. And this is incredible. So I asked him, you should all read it. It's so wonderful, and it cheers you up too. He's 93 or 94, who's counting? And I asked him, how did you manage to write that brilliant piece? Because you write so brilliant about baseball. And he said, he put it together. He wrote bits and pieces, then he juggled them around and put them together. So even a great writer, right, Roger Angell, has to juggle and fiddle and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And he told me an interesting point about E.B. White. I was in the next office when he was writing Here is New York. And he said the typewriter, blah, 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 blah. No computers. We actually made a noise when we wrote. Ba, 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 ba. Very comforting, instead of this silent stuff you get. And he said, then there'll be a long, long pause. What's happened? Has he fallen on the floor? No, he was thinking. So we'd then think a bit and then write again. And you can't write. In fact, I was going to say you can't write unless you think, but actually you don't know what you think till you've written. So it's one of those curious relationships. So coming back then to writing, how can writing be taught is what I'm often asked. Well, I think one can learn quite a lot. And in this book I'm writing, what I've been doing is going through prose that first of all I can't understand, and then finding out why can't I understand it? Or why is it taking so long? And so I went through the Obama Affordable Care Act. And I just thought I'd try and understand it. And being sort of average intelligence, and it inflamed me, not politically, because I actually think it's a very good thing myself, but it's just my political opinion. But when I read something like this, here I go. In general, notwithstanding subsection R or any other provision of this title, except as provided in subparagraph D, for purposes of determining income eligibility for medical assistance on the state plan or under any waiver of such plan and for any other purpose applicable on the plan or waiver for which a determination of income is required, including with respect to the imposition of premiums and cost sharing, a state shall use the modified gross income of an individual, and in the case of an individual in family greater than one, the household income of such family. And I asked one of my friends who's in the government, and he said, well, that's typical drafting language. I said, well, how the hell can you expect people to understand it? So then I went to another friend who's very well skilled in these matters, and here's something, if you want Social Security, grab a hold of this, because this may mean thousands of dollars for you, okay? Now I have your attention, okay? Avarice, it always works, okay? Beginning in 0100, a number holder, BIC capital A only, who has attained full retirement age, FRA, but is not yet 70, may elect to suspend his or her retirement benefit in order to earn delayed income credits, DRC. A change is part of the Senior Citizens Freedom to Work Act of 2000. This legislation eliminated the annual earnings test, AET, and the foreign work test, FWT, for those who have attained FRA. It allows beneficiaries to receive full retirement benefits regardless of earning. Prior to 0100, these benefits would have been subject to ATT or FWT or DRCs. What? What are these damned initials, acronyms? Or would have been earned for months subject to full work deduction because these beneficiaries would no longer be subject to AET or FWT. How's your Charlie? They are being given the opportunity to elect voluntary suspension of retirement benefits to earn DRCs. Thanks a lot. Which means a Social Security recipient who previously filed for Social Security benefit can suspend benefits to full retirement, 66 for most people, and earn delayed retirement credits, which means he gets an extra 8% in his Social Security. This is worth thousands of dollars once it's translated. But how many people can go through this? So one of the passions impelling me to write this book, do I make myself clear, is this is not fair. This is not fair for people to write like that. I don't care who they are. And yet, actually, one of the greatest writers alive today is President Obama. And who published his book, Dreams from My Father? I did. And the story behind that, I must tell you, it's another publishing story. Peter Osnos, who ran one of the imprints in Random House, came to me and said, I'd like to spend $40,000 on a community organizer. I said, what do you mean? What's he done? He said, well, he's been a community organizer. I said, that doesn't justify $40,000. What has he done? And he said, well, it's very well written. And Henry Ferris, who's his deputy, thinks it's very good. So I said, send it to me. So I read it, and I said, you're damn right. It is worth $40,000. It's very good writing. What happened when we published it? Did okay. Not until he made that speech about the United States of America did it take off. So when, on the inauguration eve, my wife met him with Joe Biden, and I've never said this to him, and she said, you know, my husband published your book. And he said, yeah, it's worth a lot more now, isn't it? Which was quite true. Very charming. But of course, he's a brilliant writer. And if you haven't read his book, you know what a good writer is. So what puzzles me is how somebody is so gifted can actually, I suppose he hadn't got the time, he got a few other things on his mind, to let some of this legislation stuff go through. And it's because that's standard, that's what's accepted nowadays as English, and it isn't anything of the kind. So I do think there's always capacity to improve the English language. Have I gone on too long? Now, I could go on forever, but you don't want to be too long. Maybe I should open myself up to questions. I could talk about some other things, but I think one of the things I would like to do is just if anybody here wants to know, I mean, I've written now 12 books. The most difficult one I had to write was about the history of innovators. And let me just tell you one thing, this journey of discovery. How many people here have cell phones? Or you, everybody? To whom do you owe a tremendous debt? Do you know, it's amazing how little people know about their own, what they're using. How many people know the person who gave you the capacity to talk from here to the moon, or from here to this first row? And let me just tell you, this man who gave you this capacity jumped to his death at the River House on 52nd Street. And anybody here know his name? You know, because you've read my book. Shut up. And yet, you know, we've all heard of Bill Gates. And yet this person who jumped to his death at the River House in the 50s, nobody knows him. And so this is the kind of thing which excited me when I wrote my book about innovation, and trying to understand the technology of a young kid who was growing up in the Yonkers, being a radio ham, and invented FM radio, AM radio, electric radio transmissions. He went to Columbia University. And then when he invented FM, Sarnoff at RCA stole his patents, and he had to sue them in the courts. And when he went to the court day after day after day with his briefcase and his hat on, his wife said, "Why are you wasting all this money?" And he got very angry and he hit her on it there with a poker. And she went to stay with her mother. And he was so depressed by this, that's when he put his hat and his briefcase, and instead of going to the door at the River House, went to the window and jumped to his death. And his name was Edwin Armstrong. And after my book came out, this is what's exciting about writing, when you can get an effect. Columbia University finally opened up his entire lab with all the wires and a little bronze statue of him. So writing can be a fantastic joy. And for me, writing that book and trying to understand it was to become full of admiration of people who ventured to do the really difficult things like him. Anyway, I could go on forever about writing, but that's enough, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Harry, we'll open it up to a few questions. Who would like to ask this young lady?
Why did Marlon Brando make everybody get on their knees?
Well, have you tried getting on your knees recently? It is hard to get up, for me anyway. And, well, I think it's humiliating. And, you know, that's a very good question, actually. When I thought about it at the time, I realized what he was doing. He was putting himself in a position of real strength. First of all, making you beg for the book. I paid him $5 million for that. And we made money, eventually. Other people were ready to pay 5 or 6 million. And I'm glad I didn't go on my knees. And I'm glad I wrote my proper hand. And I did defend my wife when he was attacking her. And in the end, I became good friend. My worst experience with him, how many people play chess here? I bet there's somebody who plays chess. Okay, you try and playing chess with Marlon Brando. I beat him easy the first game. Second game, he won. Third game, I thought, well, now I'm going to really try. And he won again. And he said, "Come, let us fill up the wall with our English dead." And then he went off into Shakespeare. I only got worried when he said, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Anyway. And the next time, when I first went to see him, it was in L.A. at the top of the hill next to, what's his name? Psycho. Come on, thank you. And the second time I went to him, he met me at the Los Angeles airport. He said he would, but he wasn't there. There was just a woman in a long kimono in a sports car. And I looked around, it was him. He was dressed in a kimono. And then when we came to publish the book, he said he wasn't going to do any publicity unless I agreed to come onto the television set dressed as a woman, which I refused. Anyway, it's a longer story. Okay. If I answer the question, he liked to intimidate people.
The gentleman over here.
Yeah. Robert Fisk is a investigative reporter who I'm sure you're completely familiar with, Bob Fisk. In my opinion, he's arguably one of the all-time, certainly the last 30, 40 years, his work is superior. Why does the media not cover his work? Robert Fisk.
I know Robert. Robert, very brave man. By the way, the name I was thinking of was Jack Nicholson. Oh. Jack Nicholson. Hello, Jack, said Marlon. Robert Fisk is widely published. Robert Fisk, one of the great things Robert Fisk did was in, what year was it? Was when Saddam Hussein murdered 40,000 people. And Robert Fisk covered that story brilliantly. No, Robert Fisk is one. Some people began to think he was anti-American. And that's always the reporters who see things as they are often don't fit into political slots that other people admire. But Robert Fisk is writing today for The Guardian.
Well, I don't think he's with The Guardian. The Independent, maybe.
Independent, okay, The Independent. Well, listen, I can't answer for every other editor. All I can say is that I published Robert Fisk. I'm trying to think. I can't think of many people I've suppressed who had a good story to tell. But you're right to raise questions about legitimacy of some of the writing, and some of the publishing. No, we can't. I can't say more than that. I mean, I know Robert very well. Humphrey Taylor.
In the back.
A long time ago, you wrote about your experiences of working with Rupert Murdoch. Would you like to tell us what you think his impact on British and American media has been?
I feel like with Roger Angel, one word will do: appalling. Appalling. I mean, he's a fantastically brilliant businessman. But his influence on the press has been nothing less than appalling. I mean, the British press ranges from the abysmal to the relatively virtuous. And he lowered the standards immensely. And I'm told, by the way, because I do it, he is extraordinary. I'll never forget sitting when we were going out for dinner one night, and he looked up, and it was 1980. And he said, that's the future. When he pointed up, I thought, what was he looking at, the moon? No, he said the satellite. They just started, and he said, what we're going to have is more and more satellites and communicate. I'd love to own a film studio, but I don't have the money. Of course, he eventually got more than enough to do it. So he is. I must give you the best definition of Rupert Murdoch. How many people have read Max Weber on sociology? Max Weber, okay, there's at least one Weber right there. Max Weber defined leadership according to various standards. Tribal, come to your tribal headquarters. Bureaucratic, all those lawyers in these large corporations. And charismatic. But charismatic leadership in Weber's definition was not necessarily the person was charismatic, but people regarded him as having special powers. And Rupert Murdoch's success, or success, leadership characteristic, is a charismatic leader in the following sense. One, the people around him look up to him so much that I've been in meeting after meeting after meeting trying to discuss some policy, and the constant question was, what would Rupert think? What would Rupert think? And it was asked with good reason, because the charismatic leader, and I say that's what he is actually kind of gets the reverence, whether he's right or wrong, because they all remember when he was so right and they were so wrong. So he's been so right in his predictions so often that they then think whatever he is doing must be right. And I'm told, suddenly I was in London last week, that he is actually very deeply depressed about what happened with the hacking and all that horrible, terrible, odious crimes that were committed, bribery. And there's a trial going on now, and if I were in England, such as the legal situation, 3 policemen would come to the door and lead me away if I said what I thought was happening in the trial, because there are restrictions on reporting and commenting when a case is up for trial. And when I fought the great thalidomide case for these children, we couldn't comment, though they'd been without arms and legs for 10 years and no compensation. That's another story. And they're making a film about that now.
We'll take 2 more questions. Joanne.
It's bound to be tough, this.
If today you were to start a publishing as a publisher without $5 million to offer, with Amazon and ebook, all of that, how would you do it?
How would I what?
To be a publisher.
Oh,
to
if I had $5 million to be a publisher?
Without $5 million
Oh,
to
without,
offer.
that's a good question.
Yeah, how would
Well-
you start your publishing?
Well, to publish means to make known. And the hardest part in publishing, there are so many really good books, so many really good proposals that never get known. So I'm sorry to say this, but everything you can do to market the book, to make it known, whether it's through events like we used to do at the Random House breakfast I did on Madison Avenue there, or advertising a very expensive way to get attention. Word of mouth is one, the internet, etc., etc. So how do you make things known? How do you get, well, some things go viral. Some things go viral, which are kind of funny, but not particularly significant. You probably saw the one of a baby doing push-ups like his father, or everybody saw the man jump out from space and keep descending. That going viral, so you've got millions. How can you get attention for really, really good writing? Just imagine that Obama had never made that speech of his, that brilliant speech about we are the United States of America. That book would still have sold only 20,000 copies. But once he did that speech, he was marketing his own literary ability. So I say, if I were without $5 million, I'd have to find someone in it somewhere to, or do something, or walk around with a sandwich board and say, read this book, or lift the sandwich and get a shock, you know, whatever.
The young lady here. Go ahead, you.
Yes, you're young to me, okay.
I'd like to know what you think the future of publishing is, given the fact that it's such a difficult environment now. I have a friend who's in publishing, and I've watched the newspapers go under, and people don't read books the same way they used to. So I'm wondering where you think we're going with that.
Now, I tell you what, I don't like it at all, and I'm frightened, and it won't be Rupert Murdoch's fault, that we may become a less literal society, less comprehension. I know it distresses me, actually, that there are so many people don't read a newspaper, and it particularly distresses me when they go to one television channel because it gives them back. It's like you're looking in the mirror. Oh, that's a handsome fellow. You know what I mean? Reading what they already know and believe is a curse, and I don't know how to get out of it, frankly. I'm hoping that something cosmic may happen, in a sense as big as the internet arriving and actually destroying the economic base of newspapers and to some extent of books too. So we may get to, I'm not objecting to Kindle, you understand, I understand about that. But I personally regret the solid feeling of a book. I love it. I just love it to death. And so when I travel, I have Kindle, but I'm almost just coming back, as I say, from London. I had 4 books with me, which I intended to read and did. And I've actually been fascinated by the start of World War I. And on June the 30th this year, this is the advertising, on June the 30th this year, I'm editor-at-large at Reuters. I am staging a discussion on World War I entitled, What Were They Thinking? And I've got Henry Kissinger speaking and Neil Ferguson, so you're all welcome.
Where does it?
Well, I'm trying to decide whether to do it at probably the 92nd Street Y, I think, if we can get everybody to agree. But that's an act of publishing, in a sense, because we're making it known. And then what were they thinking? It's really fascinating. It's just 2 books I'd recommend. One is called Sleepwalkers, and by Christopher Clark from Cambridge. Another one is Margaret Macmillan. Both came out very recently. Margaret Macmillan's book, The War That Ended the Peace. And they're very, very good books indeed. And there's probably going to be about 40 or 50 books about World War I. You better stop me. I'm like a serial killer. I'll go on again.
And thank you for a wonderful talk. And for those who would like to continue to ask Harry a question or two, he will be sitting right over there inscribing any of his books that you wish to purchase, and you may ask him in person.
Including the arthritic hand, okay? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Be careful going down.